The squeaking wheels of a shopping cart echo through the fluorescent-lit aisles. A young man in a store uniform moves carefully, his hands trembling slightly as he stocks shelves. The name tag reads Mark. "You don't belong here." A sharp voice cuts through the usual grocery store buzz. "Someone like you shouldn't be working where normal people shop." The words hang in the air. Phones emerge from pockets, recording what's unfolding. A crowd forms, their faces a mix of shock and discomfort. Mark's hands shake more now, a box of cereal slipping from his grasp, scattering across the floor. The well-dressed customer towers over Mark, who's now kneeling, trying to gather the scattered cereal. "See? You can't even do this right. They should keep people like you hidden away somewhere." A shadow falls across the scene. Footsteps, deliberate and measured. The crowd parts. "I saw a man once," a quiet, familiar voice speaks. The customer turns, words dying on their lips. There stands Keanu Reeves, casual in jeans and a black jacket, but his presence fills the aisle. He had all the advantages life could offer: money, status, health. But he was the poorest person I'd ever met. The air grows thick with tension. Phones keep recording, but no one dares speak. Because true wealth? Keanu kneels beside Mark, helping him gather the cereal. It isn't about what your body can do. It's about what your heart chooses to do. The customer's face flushes red. Whispers ripple through the gathering crowd. But this isn't just another celebrity intervention. What happens next will change not just Mark's life, but an entire community's understanding of human dignity. This is a true story about what happened that Tuesday morning at Wilson's grocery store, when humanity faced off against cruelty, and an unexpected hero stepped in to teach a lesson no one would forget. The morning sun filtered through the wide windows of Wilson's grocery store, casting long shadows across the freshly waxed floors. It was 7:30 a.m., and Mark Henderson had already been there for an hour, methodically preparing for another day of work. His movements were careful, purposeful, each action taking a bit longer than most people might need, but he performed them with quiet determination. Mark had worked at Wilson's for 3 years now. The store had hired him as part of their inclusive employment program, one of the few businesses in town that actively sought to employ people with disabilities. His cerebral palsy affected his motor skills, making some tasks more challenging, but Mark had developed his own system for everything from stocking shelves to helping customers locate items. The store was coming alive around him. Hannah, the morning shift manager, was turning on the registers one by one, their electronic chimes creating a familiar morning symphony. The produce team was arranging colorful displays of fresh fruits and vegetables, misting them with water that caught the early morning light. The smell of fresh bread wafted from the bakery section, where Tony had already been working since 4 a.m., preparing the day's goods. Mark loved these quiet moments before the rush began. He moved through the aisles with his cart, checking inventory and straightening products. His hands sometimes trembled as he reached for items, but his method was thorough. Each can face forward, each box aligned perfectly with its neighbors. It might take him longer, but the results were always impeccable. Regular customers had grown familiar with Mark's presence. Mrs. Peterson, who came in every Tuesday for her weekly shopping, always sought him out for help finding new products. She'd learned to wait patiently as he checked his tablet for item locations, never rushing him as he carefully typed with fingers that sometimes resisted his commands. Mr. Thompson, a retired teacher, often stopped to chat about the baseball scores, giving Mark time to form his responses without interruption. The store itself was a cornerstone of the community, one of those mid-sized grocery stores that managed to survive despite the big chains moving in. Its wide aisles and bright lighting made it welcoming, and the management's commitment to hiring diverse staff had earned them loyal customers who appreciated their inclusive approach. But not everyone shared this appreciation. As the morning progressed and more shoppers filled the aisles, Mark could feel certain stares lingering too long. He'd grown used to the occasional whispers, the impatient sighs from people who didn't understand why it took him a few extra seconds to respond to their questions. Usually, he could brush these moments aside, focusing instead on the many customers who treated him with kindness and respect. Today seemed different, though. There was a tension in the air, an undercurrent of impatience that Mark couldn't quite place. As he carefully arranged a display of breakfast cereals, he noticed more people than usual hurrying past, their carts loaded with groceries. The store was unusually busy for a Tuesday morning, and he could hear fragments of conversations about an approaching storm forecast for later in the week. What Mark didn't know, as he steadied his hands to place another box on the shelf, was that this ordinary Tuesday was about to become anything but ordinary. Among the rushing customers, two very different people were about to enter Wilson's grocery store, and their presence would transform this routine morning into a moment that would be remembered long after the storm had passed. The first sign of trouble arrived at precisely 10:47 a.m., clicking across the floor in expensive heels and designer clothing. Catherine Winters, a woman who wore her privilege like a shield, pushed her cart to the automatic doors with the air of someone who expected the world to bend to her will. Her perfectly manicured nails gripped her shopping list as her eyes scanned the store with barely concealed disdain. Mark was still working on the cereal aisle when he first heard her voice, sharp and demanding, calling out to no one in particular about the store's organization. "This place becomes more chaotic every week. Don't they have anyone competent working here anymore?" The words carried across the store, making several customers glance up from their shopping. Hannah, the morning manager, stepped forward to assist, but Catherine had already spotted Mark. She wheeled her cart toward him, the wheels squeaking against the polished floor. "You there," she called out, her voice carrying that particular tone some people use when they think they're speaking to someone who won't understand them. "I need organic quinoa. The imported kind, not that domestic stuff they try to pass off as high quality." Mark turned slowly, carefully steadying himself against his cart. He knew exactly where the quinoa was. He'd stocked it himself that morning. But as he opened his mouth to respond, his words caught slightly, the slight stutter that sometimes emerged when he felt pressure becoming more pronounced. It's in aisle 6, he managed, his hand trembling slightly as he pointed. I can show you." Catherine's perfectly sculpted eyebrows arched higher. She drummed her fingers against her cart's handle, each tap a silent accusation of time being wasted. "Oh, never mind," she cut him off. "I'll find it myself." Clearly, this is going to take all day, but she didn't move toward aisle 6. Instead, she stood there, watching as Mark returned to his task of straightening the cereal boxes. Her presence loomed over him like a storm cloud, her eyes tracking every careful movement of his hands. When a box slipped slightly, causing Mark to readjust it several times to get it perfectly aligned, Catherine made a sound, something between a scoff and a sigh. "This is ridiculous," she muttered, loud enough for nearby customers to hear. "They really shouldn't put people like this in customer-facing positions. It's uncomfortable for everyone." The words hit Mark like physical blows, but he kept working. He'd learned long ago that responding usually made things worse. Around him, other customers began to slow their shopping, some lingering unnecessarily in the aisle, their presence a quiet shield against Catherine's growing hostility. Mrs. Peterson, who had been selecting her usual breakfast cereals, stepped closer to Mark. "Dear," she said warmly, deliberately ignoring Catherine, "could you help me find those wonderful whole grain crackers you showed me last week?" But before Mark could respond, Catherine inserted herself into the conversation. "Oh, you're actually encouraging this? Do you have any idea how long you'll be standing here waiting for him to figure out what you're asking?" The tension in the aisle grew thicker. More phones appeared, held low but definitely recording. Hannah, the manager, began making her way over, having noticed the growing cluster of people and the rising volume of Catherine's voice. Mark's hands were shaking more now, but he kept working, trying to focus on the simple task of aligning boxes, of maintaining order in his small corner of the world. He'd faced people like Catherine before, people who saw his disability as an affront to their convenience, who treated his presence as an inconvenience rather than a testament to his determination. But something about today was different. Maybe it was a gathering crowd, or the way Catherine seemed to grow more emboldened by each passing moment of his silence. Or maybe it was a strange electricity in the air, the sense that something unprecedented was about to unfold. What no one in the store knew yet, not even Catherine in her designer clothes or Mark with his trembling hands, was that fate had decided to intervene. Because at that very moment, through those same automatic doors Catherine had entered earlier, another figure was about to walk in. Someone whose presence would transform this ugly moment into something none of them would ever forget. Catherine's patience snapped like a frayed thread. The quinoa incident had merely been the spark. Now the real performance was about to begin. She turned to face the growing crowd of onlookers, transforming the grocery store aisle into her personal stage. "Does anyone else see what's happening here?" Her voice carried through the store, sharp and theatrical. "We're all supposed to just stand around and pretend this is normal? That this is acceptable customer service?" She gestured toward Mark, who was still trying to focus on his work, his movements becoming increasingly unsteady under the weight of her attention. Hannah, the morning manager, finally reached the scene. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to lower your voice. All our employees are valued members of our team." "Valued?" Catherine interrupted, her laugh cold and cutting. "Is that what we're calling it now? Because from where I'm standing, this looks more like charity. Misguided charity that's forcing paying customers to suffer through this. This spectacle, the word spectacle, hung in the air like poison." Mark's hands froze on the cereal box he was holding. Around him, the crowd's murmurs grew louder, a mix of outrage and discomfort rippling through the gathered shoppers. Mrs. Peterson stepped forward again, her usually gentle face hardened with anger, but Catherine wasn't finished. "Look at him," she continued, pointing at Mark's trembling hands. "He can barely hold a box steady. How is he supposed to help customers? What happens when he drops something breakable? Who pays for that? We do, don't we? In higher prices and wasted time, and this ridiculous charade of inclusion." Each word struck like a physical blow. Mark's breathing became shallow, his chest tight with the effort of maintaining composure. The cereal box in his hands began to shake more violently, his muscles betraying him under the stress of being the center of this unwanted attention. "My grandson has cerebral palsy," a voice called out from the crowd. An elderly man stepped forward, his face flushed with emotion. "People like you are the reason he's afraid to leave his house." Catherine spun toward the new voice, her designer handbag swinging with the movement. "Oh, so now I'm the villain? For saying what everyone's thinking? For asking why we have to turn every business into some sort of social experiment?" The cereal box finally slipped from Mark's grasp, hitting the floor with a crash that seemed to echo through the suddenly silent store. As he bent to retrieve it, Catherine let out an exaggerated sigh. "See? This is exactly what I'm talking about. This isn't a daycare center. It's a business." Mark's fingers brushed the fallen box, but it seemed to skitter away from his grasp. His face burned with humiliation as he tried again, aware of every eye in the store fixed upon this moment. The fluorescent lights seemed too bright, the air too thick, the silence too heavy. Hannah moved to help him, but Catherine stepped between them. "No, no, let him do it. Since we're all supposed to pretend this is perfectly normal, let's watch how long it actually takes. Maybe then someone will finally admit this whole situation is absurd." Phones were recording openly now, their cameras capturing every second of Catherine's cruelty and Mark's distress. The air crackled with tension, a powder keg of emotions waiting for a spark. Some customers had turned away, unable to watch but unwilling to leave. Others stood their ground, their faces masks of barely contained fury. And then it happened. As Mark finally managed to grasp the box, Catherine reached down and deliberately knocked it away with her foot. "Oops," she said, her voice dripping with mock concern. "Looks like you'll have to start over. Should we all take a seat? This could take a while." The collective gasp from the onlookers was audible. Hannah stepped forward, her manager's badge catching the light. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to leave the store immediately. Leave! Catherine's voice rose higher. I'm a paying customer. He's the one who should leave. In fact, why don't we take a vote? Who here actually wants to shop in a store where they have to wait 10 minutes for someone to point them to the quinoa? Mark slowly straightened up, his face a mask of dignified pain. In his 3 years at Wilson's, he'd endured stares, whispers, and the occasional rude comment. But this was different. This was calculated cruelty, designed to strip away not just his dignity, but his right to exist in public space. The situation balanced on a nice edge. Hannah was reaching for her phone, presumably to call security. Mrs. Peterson had moved to Mark's side, her presence a silent declaration of support. The elderly man who'd spoken about his grandson was red-faced with anger, his fists clenched at his sides. And then, through the tension-filled air, came the sound of automatic doors sliding open. Footsteps approached, unhurried, deliberate. The crowd at the end of the aisle began to part, expressions of anger transforming into looks of disbelief. Catherine, too caught up in her performance to notice the shift in atmosphere, continued her tirade. This isn't about discrimination, it's about standards, about efficiency, about what paying customers should have to. Should have to what? The new voice cut through the chaos like a blade, quiet, measured, but carrying an authority that commanded attention. Catherine turned, her next words dying on her lips as she found herself face to face with one of the most recognizable actors in Hollywood. Keanu Reeves stood at the end of the aisle, his expression a mixture of concern and barely contained anger. The store fell completely silent, every eye now fixed on this unexpected development. No one moved. No one spoke. The only sound was the gentle hum of the store's refrigeration units and the soft click of phone cameras capturing the moment. The confrontation had reached its breaking point, but nobody could have predicted who would step in to defuse it, or how their intervention would change everything. Keanu Reeves stood there in his characteristic casual attire, a well-worn black jacket, dark jeans, and boots that had seen many miles. His presence carried none of the artificial polish that marked Catherine's designer ensemble, but it filled the space with an undeniable gravity. His hair was slightly disheveled, as if he'd been running his fingers through it in thought, and his expression carried that particular intensity that had marked some of his most memorable on-screen moments. He moved forward slowly, each step measured and deliberate. The crowd of onlookers parted instinctively, phones still recording, but now shifted to capture this unexpected development. The fluorescent lights caught the silver threading through his beard, and his eyes, dark and focused, never left the scene before him. What struck everyone wasn't just the surprise of seeing a Hollywood star in their local grocery store. It was a complete absence of celebrity performance in his demeanor. There was no grand entrance, no playing to the cameras that were now capturing every moment. Instead, his approach carried the weight of someone who had witnessed something fundamentally wrong and felt compelled to address it. "I've been standing there," he said, gesturing toward the store's entrance. For the past few minutes, his voice was quiet, but it carried through the silence that had fallen over the store. Watching, listening, he paused, his gaze moving from Catherine to Mark and back again, trying to understand what could make someone speak to another human being that way. Catherine's face underwent a rapid transformation, shock, recognition, and then an attempt to recover her composure. Her hand moved to smooth her already perfect hair, a reflexive gesture that betrayed her sudden uncertainty. "Mr. Reeves," she started, her voice taking on a completely different tone. "You don't understand the situation." "Actually," Keanu interrupted, still in that same quiet voice, "I understand perfectly." He took another step forward, then stopped beside Mark, who was standing very still, his hands gripping his cart for stability. "I understand that this man came to work today, like he does every day, to do his job with dignity and dedication." The air in the store seemed to thicken. Phones kept recording, but their owners barely seemed to breathe. Even the usual store sounds, the hum of refrigerators, the distant beeping of checkout scanners, seemed muted, as if the building itself was listening. "What I don't understand," Keanu continued, is how watching someone work hard, overcome challenges, and contribute to their community could possibly offend you. His words weren't loud, but they carried a weight that made Catherine take an unconscious step backward. Mark's hands had stopped shaking. He stood straighter now, as if Keanu's presence beside him had lent him strength. The morning light streaming through the store's windows caught the name tag on his uniform, making it gleam like a badge of honor rather than the target it had been moments before. Keanu reached down and picked up the fallen cereal box, the one Catherine had kicked away. His movement was smooth, natural, devoid of theatrical flourish. He examined the box for a moment, then held it out to Mark. Their eyes met in a moment of quiet understanding. "You know," Keanu said, still holding the box between them, "I've spent my career pretending to be other people. Heroes, villains, people who save the world." He turned to face Catherine, who seemed frozen in place. But the real heroes? They're the ones who show up every day, face whatever challenges life has given them, and still choose to be kind. The words hung in the air, not as a rebuke, but as a truth so fundamental it made Catherine's previous behavior seem small and shabby in comparison. Several customers nodded, and Mrs. Peterson wiped tears from her eyes. Hannah, the manager, stood straighter, pride replacing her previous defensive posture. Keanu wasn't finished, though. His next words would transform this moment from a celebrity intervention into something far more profound. A lesson about humanity that would spread far beyond the confines of this grocery store aisle. But as he opened his mouth to continue, no one could have predicted the impact his next statement would have, not just on everyone present, but on thousands who would eventually watch this moment online. Keanu shifted his weight, planting his feet firmly on the store's polished floor. His presence had transformed the grocery aisle into something more intimate than a mere public space. It had become a moment of truth. "When I was younger," he began, his voice carrying a warmth that drew everyone closer, "I watched my sister fight, not against people, but against an illness that tried to take everything from her. She taught me something I'll never forget. Strength isn't about what your body can or can't do. It's about the spirit that drives you forward when others say you should give up." Catherine's perfectly composed facade cracked slightly. Her hands fidgeted with her designer purse strap, her eyes darting between Keanu and the phone still recording every word. The mention of his sister's struggle had shifted the atmosphere, making her previous complaints seem not just cruel but profoundly shallow. "What I saw today wasn't weakness," Keanu continued, gesturing toward Mark. "I saw strength, the kind that gets up every morning, faces whatever challenges come, and still chooses to serve others. The kind that maintains dignity even when faced with cruelty." He paused, his eyes meeting Catherine's directly. "The only weakness I've seen here is the need to tear someone down to feel superior." Mark stood straighter beside him, his trembling hands now steady on his cart. The simple presence of someone defending him, not out of obligation but out of genuine respect, had transformed his entire bearing. "But here's what fascinates me," Keanu said, his tone shifting to something more contemplative. "You walked in here today, looked at this man, and saw something that offended you. You saw difference as weakness, disability as inconvenience. What I see," he smiled warmly at Mark, "I see someone who probably works twice as hard as anyone else, who has to solve problems most of us never think about, who faces prejudice with patience and still shows up to do his job." A murmur of agreement rippled through the gathered crowd. Mrs. Peterson nodded vigorously, tears streaming down her face. The elderly man who'd spoken about his grandson stepped forward, standing shoulder to shoulder with Keanu and Mark. "You mentioned efficiency earlier," Keanu continued, addressing Catherine directly. "Let's talk about that. True efficiency isn't just about speed. It's about dedication, attention to detail, and a commitment to doing things right. From what I've seen of Mark's work," he gestured to the perfectly arranged shelves, "he understands that better than most." Catherine's face had lost its haughty expression, replaced by something approaching shame. The phone cameras captured every moment of her transformation from aggressor to someone confronting the ugliness of their own actions. But this isn't just about Mark, Keanu said, his voice taking on an edge of passion. It's about who we choose to be as people. Every day, we have choices. We can choose to spread pain or healing, to tear down or build up, to see differences as weaknesses or as proof of incredible strength. He turned to face the crowd directly now, his words carrying to every corner of the suddenly silent store. I played characters who fight evil, who save the world from terrible threats. But the real evil? It's not some monster or supervillain. It's the small cruelties we inflict on each other. The moments we choose to diminish someone else's humanity because it makes us feel more powerful. Mark's eyes glistened with unshed tears. But they weren't tears of shame anymore. They were tears of recognition, of seeing himself through new eyes, reflected in the words of someone who understood that his differences weren't weaknesses but badges of honor. So here's what we're going to do, Keanu announced, his voice firm but gentle. We're going to remember this moment. Not because I'm here, honestly. That's the least important part of what's happening. We're going to remember it because right now, we all have a choice about what kind of world we want to live in. He turned back to Catherine, who seemed to shrink under his gaze. You can walk out of here holding on to your prejudices, or you can do something truly brave. Recognize that you were wrong, learn from it, and become part of the solution instead of the problem. The silence in the store was absolute. Even the phone's recording seemed to capture the weight of this moment, this unexpected intersection of celebrity, everyday life, and profound human truth. What happened next would determine not just the end of this confrontation, but perhaps change the way everyone present would approach difference and dignity in their own lives. Keanu's words hung in the air, not as a rebuke, but as an invitation, an opportunity for transformation that extended beyond Catherine to everyone witnessing this moment. The next few minutes would prove whether his intervention had truly reached its mark and whether this grocery store confrontation would become something more than just another viral video. Catherine stood motionless for several heartbeats, the weight of Keanu's words settling around her like a heavy blanket. The store's fluorescent lights highlighted the flush creeping up her neck, the slight tremor in her perfectly manicured hands. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost its sharp edge. She started, then stopped, looking around at the faces surrounding her. Faces that reflected not hatred but expectation, hope even. She turned to Mark, her designer heels squeaking slightly on the polished floor. I was cruel, unnecessarily, unforgivably cruel. I'm sorry. The words came out soft, almost broken, but they carried the weight of genuine realization. Mark, still standing beside his cart, nodded once, accepting her apology with a dignity that made her previous accusations seem even more shameful. Keanu's presence had shifted from defender to witness, allowing this moment of reconciliation to unfold naturally. The phone's recording caught everything. The way Catherine's shoulders slumped as the weight of her actions fully hit her, the quiet strength in Mark's posture as he accepted her apology, the collective exhale of the crowd as tension dissolved into something more profound. Hannah, the store manager, stepped forward. Her voice was firm but kind. We're proud to have Mark as part of our team. He represents everything we believe in: dedication, perseverance, and treating everyone with respect. The elderly man who had spoken about his grandson approached Mark. My Tommy, he said, his voice thick with emotion. He's 15. He wants to work, but he's scared of people like... He glanced at Catherine, then back to Mark. You're showing him it's possible. You're showing all of us. Mrs. Peterson, still wiping tears from her eyes, suddenly brightened. You know what? We should do something. Something to show Mark how much we value him. She turned to the growing crowd. I propose we start a social media campaign. Share this moment, yes, but more importantly, share our stories about Mark, about how he's helped us, guided us, shown us what real service looks like. The suggestion sparked immediate enthusiasm. Customers began sharing their experiences right there in the aisle. Stories of Mark's patience helping elderly shoppers find items, his thoroughness in arranging displays, his quiet determination in facing daily challenges. Keanu, who had stepped back to let this organic moment unfold, smiled softly. Sometimes, he said, his voice carrying just enough to be heard. It takes a moment of darkness to show us where the light's been all along. Catherine, who had remained quiet during this outpouring of support, suddenly straightened her shoulders. "I want to help," she said, her voice smaller but more genuine than anyone had heard it. "I need to do more than just apologize. I need to make this right." Mark, who had been silent through most of this transformation, finally spoke. His words came carefully, deliberately, but carried a strength that commanded attention. "Sometimes," he said, "people see only what's hard for me. They don't see how many things I can do. Today, thanks to Mr. Reeves and everyone here, maybe more people will start seeing differently." The impact of his words was immediate and profound. Several customers dabbed at their eyes. Hannah beamed with pride. Even Catherine nodded, understanding washing over her face as she truly heard him for the first time. The store's usual buzz began to return slowly, but it was different now. Customers moved through the aisles with new awareness, exchanging smiles, helping each other. The incident had transformed the space from a simple grocery store into a place where something miraculous had occurred, a moment of human transformation caught on camera and witnessed by dozens. As the crowd began to disperse, Keanu touched Mark's shoulder gently. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for showing everyone what real strength looks like." He turned to address the remaining onlookers. "Remember this moment, not because I was here, but because today in this store, we all learned something about what it means to be truly human." The phones finally lowered, but everyone knew this story was far from over. In the coming days, it would spread across social media, touching hearts and changing minds far beyond the confines of Wilson's grocery store. But more importantly, it had already changed everyone who witnessed it firsthand, including Catherine, who walked out of the store a different person than the one who had entered it. The video hit social media that evening. Within hours, hashtag Keanu's grocery store kindness and hashtag Stand with Mark were trending across platforms. The raw footage, captured from multiple angles, showed more than just a celebrity intervention. It captured a moment of genuine human transformation. News outlets picked up the story, but they found something unexpected. Instead of focusing solely on Keanu's presence, viewers were drawn to Mark's quiet dignity, Catherine's transformation, and the community's response. Local news stations arrived at Wilson's grocery store the next morning to find something remarkable. Customers wearing "I Stand with Mark" badges, created overnight by a local print shop that had stayed open late to meet demand. Catherine's transformation proved genuine. She returned to the store the following day, not to shop but to meet with the management. She proposed funding a program to help businesses create more inclusive workplaces, starting with her own company. "Yesterday, I was the problem," she told reporters gathered outside. "Today, I want to be part of the solution." Mark's impact reached far beyond Wilson's grocery store. Parents of children with disabilities began sharing their stories online, speaking of how the video gave them hope for their children's futures. Schools requested copies to use in their anti-bullying programs. Business leaders reached out to disability advocates, seeking guidance on creating more inclusive workplaces. The elderly man's grandson, Tommy, visited the store a week later. He stood tall beside Mark as they posed for a photo that would inspire thousands. The caption read, "Thank you for showing me that our differences don't define our worth." Tommy started his first job 3 months later, at a local bookstore that had been inspired by Mark's story to expand their inclusive hiring practices. Wilson's grocery store became a symbol of change. Their inclusive employment program, once a quiet initiative, became a model for businesses nationwide. Hannah, the morning manager, found herself giving presentations at business conferences, sharing how inclusion hadn't just been the right thing to do, It had made their store stronger. But perhaps the most profound change was the one that couldn't be captured in viral videos or news reports. It was in the small, daily interactions. Customers learning to be more patient. People choosing kindness over convenience. Communities recognizing that every person has value and dignity, regardless of their challenges. Keanu Reeves had played many heroes on screen, but his real heroism that day was in holding up a mirror to society, showing both its flaws and its potential for transformation. His words in the grocery store continued to resonate. The real heroes are the ones who show up every day, face whatever challenges life has given them, and still choose to be kind. Mark still works at Wilson's grocery store. His hands still tremble sometimes as he stocks shelves, but he stands taller now, knowing that his presence makes a difference. Every day, he proves that true strength isn't about physical ability. It's about the courage to be yourself in a world that doesn't always make that easy. And in grocery stores, offices, and communities across the country, people remember the lesson learned that day. That sometimes the most powerful changes don't come from grand gestures or celebrity interventions, but from simple moments of choosing to see the dignity in every human being. The story that began with cruelty ended by revealing the very best of human nature, reminding us all that change is possible, one interaction at a time.